to Transformation in Trials. Welcome to Transformation in Trials. This is a podcast exploring all things transformational in clinical trials. Nothing is off limits on the show, and we will have guests from the whole spectrum of the clinical trials community. And we're your hosts, Ivanna and Sam.
Welcome to another episode of the Transformation in Trials podcast. I'm joined as usual by my co-host Ivanna Rosendahl, and today we've got a great guest, Matt Wilson, who is CEO and founder of a really exciting tech company called mended, and more about that later. Welcome to the show, Matt.
Thank you very much for having me on.
No problems at all. So, Matt, I know we've met before, but and our listeners don't have any real insight into you and your background. But what we're going to do is dive straight into the topic of today's show, and that is population level research. So we have quite a broad church in terms of listeners to the Transformation in Trials podcast. Some people will be very knowledgeable about this topic, and others, including myself, will have a minimal insight into this particular topic. So perhaps just to get us started, you could give us the elevator pitch for what is population level research.
Yeah, no problems. Thanks, Sam. And Ivanna, thank you for having me on. At a really high level, the whole idea of population level research is that what we want to be able to do is try to broaden the net in terms of the number of patients that are involved in clinical studies. And I use that in a very broad sense, not necessarily interventional clinical trials, but perhaps large-scale observational programs. Because what that allows us then to be able to do is have a much more detailed, characterized view of a significant subset of an overall patient population, which then really allows us to be able to do lots of exciting things in terms of understanding that patient population more deeply, and then ultimately having that patient population characterized so that you can then engage them in further research opportunities, which can drive research forward in a way that we haven't always been able to do previously.
Got it. Fascinating. So it crosses into the topic is broad. It crosses into interventional studies, but are we primarily focusing here on observational studies? Is this where the real opportunity lies, or do you think there's opportunities across the piece?
Yeah, I think if I start with from our perspective, what we're really excited about is there's now for a long time there's been organisations that have used aggregated data sets and existing databases in order to be able to create insights around specific patient populations. Particularly over the last 10 to 15 years, as we've seen a maturity in electronic health records, that has really kind of come to the fore. And I'd kind of encapsulate that in a bucket, which is real world evidence. Yeah. However, the problem with that is that, there's a fundamental break between that data and then the patient themselves, because when we're aggregating large amounts of health record data, that's all pseudonymized or fully anonymized. And so therefore that link with the patient's broken, and it's really very difficult to be able to get back to them in any scalable way. And that's a problem then if you then want to do something else with that patient population based on the information that you're getting from their data, because if you want to go back and ask additional questions in an observational format, or you want to invite them to be part of an interventional clinical program, it becomes really difficult to be able to execute that at scale. So what are, our perspective around this, and, what we see as being a much broader sort of catalyst is the ability to take all of the great stuff that's been built on over the last 10 to 15 plus years around real world data and database studies, and then converting that into actionable programs that we can deliver within a consented but large scale patient population.
Got it. So in the way that observational research is currently done, then how does that connection happen today with the patient? Because what it sounds like to me is whoever runs the study stands to benefit because they get the data, but how about the patient? I guess holistically they might benefit, but is there any direct benefit to the patient?
Yeah, and I think that's the key thing, is that observational research and prospective observational research has been around, for a very long time. So that's not new. It's about how do you execute that, because traditionally the problem with any type of study has been the fact that the healthcare provider really creates a bottleneck in terms of how scalable and repeatable that those studies can be, even in observational research, because you still generally have to undertake some activity at the level of the healthcare provider site, organization, in order to be able to identify a relevant patient population, outreach, engage them, consent them, and then ultimately collect data from them. And although there's now tools that can kind of support that downstream activity to a degree in terms of data collection, it still creates a huge amount of burden. And what that then does is also exclude a significant proportion of the patient population where healthcare providers, don't have either the expertise or the bandwidth to engage in this type of research. So from a practical point of view, it's about, like, how do we unshackle the limitations around how we deliver this program. And for us, it's focusing on how can we automate a lot of those processes that traditionally exist at the level of the healthcare provider site on their behalf, in order to be able to create much more accessibility for patients to be part of these programs, and for patients actually the ability to engage in these programs in a way that's much more accessible. Because our experience of running these type of programs is patients are desperate to want to be part. They want to help, and it's not because they are getting a £20 Amazon voucher, which we don't provide, by the way, in the studies that we do. But traditionally there's been a lot of observational research that has tried to incentivize patients because it's been quite burdensome to them. The whole point of doing this is actually most patients are doing it because they want to help. Often these patients have got existing chronic diseases. They understand how important it is for them to be able to contribute to research, and it's about providing a means to allow them to do that in a way that is not burdensome, and also allows them to be able to see how what they've contributed actually has then benefited research inside that disease area. And that, again, is something that's always traditionally been very hard to do, because that link back with the patient is often broken. And so you end up spending ages completing questionnaires or doing other things, and then you never hear anything more about what actually happened. So and the whole point of what we're doing in terms of the technology platform is to try to create that feedback loop, so patients are automatically notified about, actually, this is the research that you've contributed to, and this is what the outcome has been. So there's a whole bunch of sort of touch points there, which we can dive into in more detail, if it's useful.
Yeah, no, I think it's fascinating. In my kind of fairly limited experience of this, I've always found this particular segment to be a bit of a black box in terms of what actually happens. And you get out into the real world, there's so many variables there, so many things, intangibles, that it becomes really difficult to get your arms around anything. So from my standpoint, anything that can kind of make it all a bit more tangible is great. Ivanna, I know you were furiously coming off mute there, so I think you've got a question.
Yes. Well, Matt, this is a very interesting perspective, and a shout out to an episode that we very recently did about the access to treatment for diverse population groups, especially for women. Historically, a lot of drugs have not been tested on the female population. So I'm just thinking, could there be an angle here that by broadening the population, you could also include other kinds of participants in some of these trials?
100%. And I think there's two parts of that. One is kind of broadening that kind of base population. We've actually been able to show this incredibly. We've shown that we can do this really well in a couple of the early programs that we've been doing. And the reason that we've been able to do it is because essentially we are taking that process that's normally both biased and manual at the level of the healthcare provider and automating it. It removes those biases and also allows us to be able to engage patients with content that actually speaks to them. And what I mean by that is that because we can automate the targeting and outreach of those patients based on the underlying health record data, when the patient receives that communication, it can be targeted to them based on ethnicity, based on age, and gender, and we can actually provide content that speaks to them. And we did this in a particular study where they were having challenges, particularly with recruiting patients in an ethnic minority group to their observational program. And what we did is that we were able to target ethnic minority cohorts based on their recorded ethnicity in their health record data, and provide them different content that actually explained why it was important to have ethnic minority representation in clinical trials. And we changed the imaging to make it representative of the people that we were trying to target. And the percentage of patients that went from essentially receiving that message through to actually participating in the study went from about 4% to 22% just through those changes. So actually being able to create channels in engagement that are highly targeted and not just generic makes a huge difference to how we can engage broader patient populations in this type of, in research more broadly. So I think it's a really, really important piece. And the other aspect is just going out to a big population, because the other aspect of that is that if you've got a very, very large cohort which are engaged in a specific observational program, then you've got much greater opportunity to characterize those patients in the specific area that you're interested in. And that's not just necessarily in terms of demographics, but also in terms of, disease characterization as well, where you're looking often for very specific subgroups of patients in order to be able to, effectively move forward your development program. So actually, it's the scale aspect of this is also really key in being able to move things forward.
Now that's very interesting, and also amazing how you can achieve results by targeting the information differently. But I am curious, how do you avoid bias in the way that you communicate to these different kinds of groups?
Yeah, really good question, actually, because it's one thing that we've been challenged on quite a lot. And, I think the short answer as well is that anybody that says that they can remove bias altogether, I think is probably not being truthful. So I think there's always aspects of that. I think there's a whole bunch of trends that have made the traditional challenges around digital engagement less defendable. So, the traditional challenges that people were getting, 5 years ago and we still get today is, particularly more elderly people or people with disabilities, are they really going to be able to engage on their phone? And the answer is surprisingly yes. I think there's the pandemic has actually also created a shift in terms of people's requirement to actually engage with digital channels. So it's very difficult to actually conduct your life now without in some way being able to engage, with digital channels. And therefore, people are very familiar and patients are very familiar with being engaged by their healthcare provider through digital channels, as well as non-digital channels. And I think that's made a huge effect in terms of the adoption of this in what were traditionally more difficult to reach patient populations. And to give an example, again, one of the programs that we're running, which is a sort of medical device study, we've had several patients aged over 95 go through this entire process of receiving, a text message with an embedded web link, clicking through that, going through a remote-based consent process, and then actually completing the study. Now, in some circumstances, they may have had some help from relatives, and there's a whole bunch of other things that we do to make sure that we can support that patient. So if the patient doesn't have a smartphone, for example, we have a clear way of them contacting a traditional study support line, so we can provide that engagement to them, through a desktop email or through, or being able to send it to a relative that actually can help them. So I think there's a whole, and again, I think most people are now, it's very difficult, as I say, to kind of function, outside of clinical trials without having some kind of interaction with the digital. And that may not be that you're the one doing it, and it may be that it's your carer or your children that are helping you do that. But I think the idea that this intrinsically creates bias in terms of digital engagement routes, I think I'm not saying there's not an aspect of that, but it's definitely nowhere near as true as it was 10 years ago.
Got it. And I must admit, even if I go to the toilet at Paddington train station, I'm at the urinal, I look up, there's an advert staring in my face asking if I want to enroll in a bladder incontinence trial. So not sure if that's biased, but I think it's everywhere. So yeah, I think you kind of touched upon some of this, Matt, but I guess this is a big problem. There's lots of people that are, I would imagine, are trying to tackle different parts of this problem. Could you maybe touch upon some of the solutions to this problem, both that you're involved in and more broadly across the industry, in terms of how others might be solving it?
Yeah, absolutely. And as I say, I think one set of organisations that are doing a fantastic job around this is what those sort of advancing real world evidence organisations, because they've become much more sophisticated over time. And whereas before it was, the data was generally very poor, and actually the value of that data was limited. There are organizations out there that are really doing cutting edge stuff around how we can use that aggregated data in order to be able to support both, clinical trial design, early stage drug development, right the way through to actually creating, evidence for submissions to support label expansion, for example, of existing drugs that are out there. So there's some really exciting things that I think have made a huge difference and will continue to make a huge difference over the coming years. There's companies, Aetion are doing some fantastic work in this space. The same, Trinetics and others are also starting to do some fantastic work, and increasing sophistication around the data science aspect of this allows more and more insights, and also a correction in terms of some of that bias that you see from data that's being collected from routine care. And equally on the other side, I think there's a lot of organizations now that have recognized that building disease-specific patient populations is also an incredibly valuable thing to do. And they come in all sorts of flavors, as most, I'm sure you guys are sort of familiar with. Some of them are charity and patient advocacy groups that are essentially building their organic communities around the specific diseases that they're focused on. Again, I think that some of the challenges around that are both around sustainability and cost, because it's actually very hard to do that. And the second is again around bias. Unfortunately, you do tend to get the type of people that engage with patient support communities are not necessarily representative of every type of patient with that disease. So I think there are some challenges there, but again, I think there's a lot more rigor around that now than there has been, previously. And there's some fantastic organizations doing that as well. The other one of the other organizations that, I think is, fascinating, and perhaps we could talk a bit more about, and not necessarily in a good or bad way always, but just fascinating is, the 23andMe aspect of this, because effectively what they've done is create a very large patient population, direct-to-consumer patient population, which are well characterized based on the data that they've provided, both from a DNA sampling perspective, but also phenotypic data that they've provided through 23andMe as well. So, there's some interesting stuff. But Sam, it sounded like you wanted to jump in.
No, carry on with that. I think if you could elaborate a bit more on the 23andMe example, that would be really interesting.
Yeah, so putting aside the sort of questions, I think, about their approach, which is, maybe feels a bit like a bait and switch to some people, like, come and find these insights, and now we're developing drugs. Is but putting aside that, which I think is a genuine debate that I think is outside the realms of my expertise, I think what they've done is very interesting in the sense that they, from the get-go, what they've done is said, well, what we need to do is create something that's actually valuable for the patient to engage with. It's great creating a kind of patient community, but what you need to actually do is provide value to the patient in order to be able to build a significant patient population. And then the characterization aspect of that comes from, again, cleverly, obviously collecting DNA as part of that consumer offering, but also using their kind of consumer insights dashboard to encourage patients to submit additional information around their phenotype effectively, which then creates this really interesting, deeply characterized patient cohort. Again, it doesn't remove that issue of bias. I mean, what type of people kind of do 23andMe? It's not going to be those types of patients that are traditionally very difficult to reach, underrepresented. So there's still that aspect of it. But I think, the approach in terms of what we need to do is create well-characterized patient populations that have, at least to a degree, been consented to be engaged in research, I think is a positive step, and I think the way that we'll see the industry evolving.
This is a slightly salesman type question, but how are all of these things monetized? Like who pays for this type of technology? Who stands to benefit from it? Because it's great to do all of these great things, but ultimately, as we know, somebody has to pay, right?
Yeah, and I think that for us, there's I can speak to what I understand about 23andMe, but I probably better if I just speak about what we do.
Yeah,
which is,
sure.
For us, it's about answering questions that are traditionally, practically, or financially infeasible to answer. So for me, there's a wherever you are in the product's life cycle, from early stage drug development right the way through trials and post market, there's always questions, right? There's always questions like, how should I, are my in silico models correct? How can I validate those against, real samples from real patients with specific diseases? How should I design my early stage clinical trials in order to be able to optimize them? How can I create my clinical trials in a way that's going to build the evidence that we need to be able to effectively get market access and kind of drive adoption of these drugs to the patients that actually need them, and then further on, there's always questions, and some of those questions can be answered through existing databases and biobanks and things like that, but not all of them. And then there's some questions that you need a formal RCT to answer as well. But there's a whole bunch of other questions that people have that would have a huge impact on how we accelerate development and the research space more broadly, which are very difficult to answer with essentially one of those two options. And for us, it's about saying there's now a kind of third option where actually you can answer very specific questions about specific disease populations that you thought you previously couldn't answer. And so from our point of view, it's about, in a very transparent way, working with industry and academics and saying, look, we've built these cohorts of patients, and we have these access to a very even broader patient population through our provider network using our technology. So, how can we help you answer these questions that are going to be able to move forward your needs as a research organization?
Awesome. And I think that's a good segue into a little bit about UMed, actually, Matt, because I think all of our listeners are going to be very curious to hear not only about the problem, but equally about how you and your organization are trying to tackle this problem. So maybe you could give us some specific examples on where you fit into the ecosystem and like the actual specifics as to how your technology really helps in this context.
Yeah, certainly. And I know we sort of alluded to a few bits of it in the discussion so far, but essentially what UMed's done is we've created a technology platform that's embedded inside a network of healthcare providers in the UK. That's now just under 4 million patients worth of providers in general practice, and we're now starting to operationalize in the US as well, where we've got our sort of first healthcare provider partners in the US as well, and soon actually Australia. And what that common infrastructure allows is for us to be able to identify specific patients based on the underlying health record data, but then very importantly, directly reach out on behalf of those institutions to those patients and effectively act, on their behalf as a proxy, not just to provide them information about a specific clinical trial, though we can clearly do that, but actually go much further and undertake a lot of those tasks that would traditionally be very burdensome for the healthcare provider to do. So whether that's screening, consent, and ultimately downstream data collection from the patients at home, that's the kind of area that we are really focused on. And that's not in the context of decentralized trials. We don't directly get involved in interventional studies other than to support the recruitment to them. But actually the broader opportunity is how we're using this to then create disease-specific cohorts which are consented into large-scale cohort registry-type programs. But uniquely, we're able to re-engage those patients, characterize them, re-engage them, to enable a sort of ever-growing, very valuable set of data from a very explicitly consented patient cohort that can serve the needs of our research clients. So that's what UMed's done, and we to give a specific example of one program two programs that we're running actually. So one is in Parkinson's, where actually it's our first sort of if you like in-house cohorts of patients, where we are consenting patients into a broad-based sort of observational program, longitudinal observational program, where we're able to combine health record data with patient-reported data and then DNA samples we're collecting from those patients at home, and then using that to be able to create this deeply characterized data set, but then still be able to re-engage those patients with inside that, that standard, that existing study, to collect additional data based on the needs of specific researchers so it allows them to be able to collect very specific data without having to run standalone studies. So that's one program we're doing, and another where we're sort of running standalone programs for specific sponsors. We've doing a fantastic program at the moment with a med device company, where we've been able to target a whole set of respiratory disease patients, with very specific diagnoses. Use what UMed does to find these patients through our network, engage them, consent them, and then actually collect both patient-reported data and facilitate the engagement of those patients with the medical device that's under evaluation, and then collate all of that data, link it with the health record data, and that whole end-to-end process. That's recruiting well over 700 patients into that program, of which we're about 90% of the way there now. Not only have we been able to do that extremely quickly, the fact is that all of the GPs that are participating in that it's created no burden for them. So suddenly it's opened the gates to all of these organizations that traditionally would like to be part of research but just haven't got the time or resources. We've been able to demonstrate how we can access that very broad patient population and deliver really meaningful studies. So hopefully, sorry, there was a bit of a ramble, but hopefully that was a useful sort of snapshot.
It's super exciting, and I think there's so many different avenues that you're solving problems for. It's not because I work in the clinical space. You sometimes end up thinking in a quite linear way, trial to trial. But it sounds like what you're doing, there's just various different kind of value opportunities across multiple different levels. It's fascinating. Ivanna, I know you've got a question.
Yeah, I'm just curious, because this is a different way for patients to engage with the opportunity to participate in clinical trials or have their data be part of a clinical trial. How have they responded to this so far?
Yeah, it's a great question. Again, coming back to kind of what the value is for patients, I think and there's been some great research actually that was done about this. I mean, there's lots of different organisations, but that have done some good stuff on this. I think it was the Wellcome Trust did some fantastic research into about 2016 around use of patient data, which is a few years ago now, but I think it's reflected, which says, you know, I think there's also what I call a sort of middle class fallacy, that the type of people that are, you know, often senior leaders or decision makers inside various organizations are the type of people that are very worried about secondary use of their data. And actually, when you speak to, and they're like, well, nobody would ever agree to that. And actually you speak to patients, and the vast majority of patients are like, no, that's fine. Like, you feel free to use that. And actively, I want you to use my data, with some caveats, which is, as long as there is a transparency over who has access to that there's a clear value for that, you know, for either for me or for society, and ideally some control over that as well. And I mean, that's one of the key things that we're able to do, is that because normally often in these programs where you're collecting large amounts of data around specific patients, you end up having to do this very broad-based consent, which I think is challenging, again, because you end up having to say, like, we can kind of use your data for anything, but don't worry about it. We'll make sure it's all okay. And I think that I understand why that's needed to happen, but I think it's reasonably unsustainable, because you know, how broad should that consent be? So the nice thing about the way that we approach this is, although we consent patients very broadly up front to being part of these programs, what we do is proactively engage those patients based on which organizations we're working with. So it gives them the opportunity to say, look, we're doing a specific program with this research organization, whether it be academic or industry. If you don't want the data that you're, you know, essentially contributing to be a part of that, you can opt out of a specific program. So it gives those patients control. The vast majority of patients don't do that, because they've already essentially highlighted themselves as a type of patient that wants to be part of these programs. But what it does is, again, it creates that transparency where we can also then say, and by the way, we'll tell you what's been, you know, what the outcome of this is. And that might just be, you know, as simple as saying there's been an abstract presented about this at this conference, you know, and you'd be surprised, like, and especially if you provide it in obviously a plain English way, patients are ecstatic about that. They love the idea of understanding the thing that they've done, even if it's just a questionnaire or, you know, doing a DNA sample, that what they've done actually is having an impact on research within their disease area, you know. Even if that's relatively minor, you know, that is what people get really excited about. And the analogy I always use is blood donation, actually, because the NHS blood donation service do this fantastically. So for those people that haven't given blood recently, is when you go in, you have your blood donated, you know, you donate your blood, and then they'll text you afterwards telling you where your blood went, like in region, so like to a specific hospital, to a specific NHS trust, and then they'll tell you when that. They obviously can't tell you, you know, the details of the patient, but they'll tell you when that's actually then being used, and it creates this like real sense of what I'm giving is actually doing something useful. And I think that's something that's been broken when people have been thinking about not just data, health data, but more broadly in terms of patients' participation in research is there's this belief that there's always a reason for them to do it themselves. And, you know, and of course in RCTs, there's that element of maybe I'm not getting the placebo, maybe this can help me. And that's very different. But I think in a much broader set of studies, it's about, you know, how am I contributing? You know, how can I help? So yeah, that's my thoughts on that.
I think some of those feedback loops to get the information back, to use your example, Matt, of the blood donation, I think that's really important, actually, because I sometimes feel if I sign up for something, the organization gets all my data, what do I get as the individual? I get no feedback. I get no real kind of information back. So I think it's an important point. Could you give us an insight into some of the technology that's behind some of these solutions? Like if I'm a patient, what do I get? What do I receive? And then from the data standpoint too, how does it actually work in terms of targeting these patient populations?
Yeah, it's probably best to start with that second piece actually. So without going too much into the secret sauce of what we're all about, essentially what we have is agreements in place with healthcare providers that enable us to access that health record data such that we can use that to search against and then use that to find specific patient cohorts based on their underlying health record data. And then we have a very slick sort of process that allows those organizations to choose whether or not they would like those patients that we've identified to be part of that program. And then once that happens, we can then outreach to those patients and actually engage them. And it's primarily through text message. So, and again, the reason why we've done that is patients are now very used to getting text messages. And there's some great actual studies out there that have looked at this. And, there's one study title is, look, if you want to contact patients, do it via text message, and it is genuinely, and obviously the cost element of this is great because the incremental cost of a text message is much less than a letter. And the other aspect of it is that you can customize these in a much more effective way, both in terms of the text message, but then when within there's an embedded web link URL, and then that takes them out to a browser where we can then take them through a study specific experience. So it's not an app, and we actively don't use an app. And part of the reason for that is that, a few years ago, a lot of the functionality of the browsers was very limited in your phone, and actually now that's not the case. So there's not much that your smartphone browser can't do that a native app can't. So the value of that and asking patients to download an app is often prohibitive, and you get a lot of kind of loss of patients during that that action. So making this really, really nice and smooth process for patients is a huge, makes a huge difference. So as I say, there's a number of other different ways that we engage. There's various different support that we provide around that to make sure that the patients always have a way of getting help when they need it. And and it's been really highly effective. As I say, we've had very high conversion rates, and they only go up as we are continuing to learn how to target patients more effectively.
Interesting. Yeah, I think removing friction from any process for the stakeholders involved is key, I think, particularly for adoption. So, and I can certainly vouch for the fact that I read all my text messages. I don't look at all of the notifications that I get from apps like Facebook or LinkedIn, etc. So yeah, I agree. Any challenges? Because I think that unfortunately, particularly in the UK, there's a lot of spamming going on and a lot of people trying to pretend to be somebody that they're not and having spurious links in text messages. Have you had any pushback around that at all?
A little bit. Again, part of that is there's a couple of things. Again, because of the way that we can target patients, we can provide information in that text message that demonstrates that it's coming from their recognized healthcare provider. It's obviously being powered by us, but it's from the patient's perspective, it's coming from their GP. And so there's a number of things that we can put in there that really kind of help build trust, help patients understand that this is a valid and appropriate kind of text message. There's a bunch of other things that we're also now doing, which I don't want to give too much away, but there's a bunch of other things that we're doing which also kind of help address particularly those patient populations where there's perhaps more skepticism particularly more elderly patient populations. There's a bunch of initiatives that we've started now, which have demonstrated that actually, again, it really helps remove that issue of, is this a spam text or not? So there have been individual cases where that's been challenged, but most of the time, we've been able to demonstrate that patients do engage with this, and they engage with it at scale. It's worked really well.
And what about catering for different languages? Because we're in a diverse population, right? And not everybody speaks English. Can your technology accommodate that?
Yeah, absolutely. And we can, and again, where there's information in the health record that suggests that they speak a certain language as a primary language, we can use that as a trigger to provide that content in their native language. Where that information is not there, the whole key thing is just providing those options and making it easy for patients to be able to select a language that's appropriate to them. But again, this is the beauty of being able to create digital engagements, targeted digital engagements, is because, imagine if you're a GP practice and you're like, you're in an area where there's 10 different, primary different, languages that are being spoken, and you're expected to give different content to each of those different groups of patients. It becomes prohibitive in terms of being able to do that. So what you end up with is like just this horrendous single leaflet that's in like 10 different languages and looks awful, and nobody ever so that whole issue of actually providing the right content to the right patient at the right time, again, it's something, if you spoke to somebody at a marketing agency, a consumer marketing agency, they'd be like, yeah, of course. We've been doing that for 20 years. Like, why? Like, we're not just going to send generic content to every person. So the idea that we would do the same I think, again, we're just a bit behind the curve in terms of that.
Totally agree. It's interesting because we had somebody else on the show. They were talking about bias when it comes to treatments. Specifically, this was a deep brain stimulation treatment for a specific therapeutic area. And they'd run a study that found that for whatever reason, more men uptook that particular deep brain stimulation treatment versus women, and they couldn't put their finger on why. And maybe some of that is down to like the way the information is conveyed, and it's not being tailored for the appropriate audience. I'm just hypothesizing here. I've got nothing to base this on, but
but you're right. I think the thing is that this has been outside of healthcare. This has been studied deeply. So and we know that there's all sorts of biases in terms of if it's been written by a man, it will generally you'll get more engagement from men, and there's even when you try not to have bias or influence over it, just the inherent nature of being who you are, I think makes it very difficult. So content for patients in clinical trials that speak to patients is really important. Even patient information leaflets, patient information sheets, again, I think there's been some studies that we've worked with that again, outside of the specifics of what UMed do, recognize that it's important to be able to provide different versions of the information leaflets to say different age groups. And again, that's something that's been done for quite a long time. Clearly, if it's a pediatric trial, you have content, a patient information sheet for the child participant and for the parents as well, and that's been done for a long time. But why wouldn't you also have different versions of the patient information leaflet based on different ethnicities, and maybe even genders, and things like that. If it helps actually reduce bias. I think part of the challenge is that because that's a very manual process, there is a limit to how much you can customize that content. Whereas the beauty of kind of digital channels is that actually the process of distribution and targeting can be heavily automated.
Absolutely. I think we could talk about this for a long time, but I'm conscious of time. And as we start to draw the interview to a close, we always finish with a final question. And that is, if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing in our industry, what would you wish for?
Oof. And I know you gave me this beforehand, and I completely thought you were going to ask it. So you may have to do some editing here to remove the huge silence that's going to happen in a minute. I think the key thing is actually, dare I say, open-mindedness. I think it's been talked about in plenty of other places, but the pandemic, I think, has been a great example of how you can create change if you want to, in terms of clinical trial process. But the key thing is that there wasn't a drive from within inside the industry to make those changes. Partly because, and I think there's a couple of things that are driving that. One is nobody likes change. So, it's a highly regulated industry. There's a good reason why we don't just flip-flop between different initiatives from one day to the next. That they're all really good, reasons for not wanting, to just adopt the next new shiny thing. And then equally as well, I think there's a lot of people's jobs that are entrenched in some of those established processes as well, which may feel threatened, by new things that are coming through. So I can understand why there's often aversion to adopting new ideas. But I think if you could change something, it would just be an openness to try and willingness to engage with new ideas, new ways of doing things, recognizing that they might not all work, but actually the end benefit for patients is, for some of them is likely to be very significant. And as long as they're done in the right way, it would be fantastic if we could create more openness. And as the last thing I'll say, I do think, my personal experience of this is that I think that is changing. And, we've our experience as a young company trying to do something innovative, has generally been actually very positive when we've been engaging with industry. But I think there's always opportunity to do better, right? And I think if we could have more openness, and that could be done, and innovation could be done within the realms of what's safe and what's correct, but with more gusto, I think that would be a great thing for everybody.
Absolutely, and that was a great answer. We don't need to edit any of that out. Perfect. You've been a great guest, Matt. Where can our audience reach out to you to find you if they've got further questions on UMed, this topic, or indeed anything else?
Yeah, no problem. So if you check out our website, it's umed.io, umed.io. There'll be all the information there with contact details if you need to reach out to us. So thank you again ever so much, Sam, Ivanna, for having me on. It's been great.
Brilliant. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
You're listening to Transformation in Trials. If you have suggestions for a guest for our show, write to hosts@transformationintrials.com. You can find more episodes in Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and the show notes are available at transformationintrials.buzzsprout.com. Thank you for listening.